But let's talk a little bit about this squatter who rents out a Queens building in New York. He said this guy's name is Peter Zaffron, or at least that's what he calls himself. And there's this building that's been abandoned for about 10 years. And every day, this is the story out of My Fox, New York, every day, Otelia John brings her 1-year-old daughter, Ariana, to her mother's to babysit while she goes to work. It is also too dangerous in her building, the only occupied one for the entire block of Jamaica Avenue. It's not clear who owns the property, vacant for more than a decade, but she jumped at the chance to rent her own room for $250 a week. She shares a 3-bedroom, 2-bath apartment with 2 other women and pays rent to a man called Peter Zaffron, who did not want his face on camera. He told me he took over the property under the law of adverse possession. Now, adverse possession, guys, is when the actual ownership of a property is in dispute. And so since this property is tied up in, or not in dispute, but that there's no clear owner of the property. This property is currently in dispute. Nobody knows who actually owns the title for the building, but it's been wrapped up in the legal process and all the bureaucratic red tape for over a decade. And so this guy, who's a squatter, just decided, you know what? I'm just going to go in. I'm going to start renting out rooms. And he says, you want a room in here? You got to pay me some money, and you can come and live here. And I don't know if he's got electricity on or whatever, but it is ingenious. It's smart. Somebody's getting some use out of it. They said it's very dangerous there. I imagine it would be in that part of town, and the people who will pay for squatter rights to live in an abandoned building. But I think this story, while interesting, really does not touch on the heart of the issue, which is why are there buildings in New York, hundreds of them, that have been vacant for years or decades, that are run down, that are basically unlivable in a city with as much wealth and as much entrepreneurship as comes from New York City? And the answer, folks, is that they have something called rent control in New York. And what rent control says is it was always designed, and keep in mind, they always design these programs to help the little guy, to help people, because rental prices continue to skyrocket in the city, and people weren't able to afford a nice apartment anymore, and they were being pushed out of the city into the suburbs, or they were forced to live in very cramped spaces, or they were forced to double up with other people, and it was just getting out of control, and the government came in and said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to help you all out. We're going to restrict the amount of money that any rental property owner can charge to you in rent. We're going to limit it to X amount of dollars. And by doing that, what we'll do is we'll keep all of these greedy landlords from running up the prices on you and driving you out of your homes and out of your neighborhoods so that they can tear down your old buildings and build these nice new skyscrapers to sell to rich people. Right? It's designed to protect the poor. The problem is, as is almost virtually every case, what was intended to help the poor actually ended up hurting them. Because the reason that prices go up in neighborhoods, the reason that prices go up in buildings is through something called supply and demand. And also causes from government regulations, such as all the fees and fines and licensings and bureaucratic red tape that they have to go through in order to have a building like that. And so as those prices go up, rents have to adjust likewise. In addition, if you have someone waiting on the sidelines who's willing to pay $2,000 for a 1-bedroom apartment, then why would you sell it to someone for less than that? So as the market rates for these properties continued to climb, the government just simply set in and said, nope, no more. We're going to cut it off. The problem is that government cannot adequately regulate any industry. They cannot possibly know on this block versus that block what rental prices should be in this neighborhood versus that neighborhood. What about this building that's a little more run down, or this building that's a little bit nicer? How do we know where rental prices should be structured? You can have buildings sitting right beside each other. One of them is totally remodeled, beautiful new building. The other one is 20, 30, 50 years old. The government does not know how to price individual apartments. The only people who know how to do that are buyers and sellers. So by arbitrarily setting that price and then not making adjustments to it because the government has no idea how to make those adjustments, what happens is over time, costs go up, but rental rates do not. So what ends up happening? Well, now all of a sudden, landlords don't start fixing problems that exist in the building. We start to see deterioration. Toilets get clogged, the landlord doesn't show up. Pretty soon, the landlord just stops answering the phone at all. Doesn't worry about it. All of a sudden, the tax bill comes. He doesn't have the money to pay the taxes on the building because the rental prices do not give him enough profit to pay his taxes. And so he simply walks away from the building. Says, I'm done. I give up. I'll just leave the building. I'll sell the building if I can, or I'll just turn the keys back over to the bank and say, here you go. I'm done. Can't do this anymore. That in turn ends up creating the vacant buildings that you see all throughout New York City and places like San Francisco, other places that have rent control. The bank in turn has to figure out what to do with this, but they can't sell it to somebody else because no one else can make any money off of the building. The only people who are exempt from rent control are the very wealthy. If you're going to build a luxury high-rise in New York City, you do not have to abide by the rent control laws. So what do you think ends up happening? What type of homes, what type of structures do you think contractors end up building? Luxury homes. Remember, this was all designed to help the poor, the impoverished, those who needed your help. Government was stepping in to fix the problem, to get those greedy landlords from fleecing their customers. So now we have more and more lower rent apartments, cheaper apartments designed for people who of low incomes that end up continuing to be abandoned and living in and be in disrepair. And every new building that's being constructed is being constructed for the wealthy. In addition, some other consequences that happen is you get older people or people who are managed to get into a rent-controlled apartment who then hold that apartment far longer than they should or would under normal rental conditions. So what a 3-bedroom, 2-bath that someone's been living in for 50 years, they continue to maintain that apartment rather than selling it and moving into a smaller, more economical apartment because rent control makes it financially feasible for them to do so. That further limits supply. And now you've got situations where a young entrepreneurial guy, I don't know if he's young or not, but an entrepreneurial guy comes out and says, I got this abandoned building. I need to make a buck. What I'll do is I'll just start leasing out rooms here. But this is a problem. These problems exist every time rent control is instituted. You know where you don't see this? In places where there is no rent control. People make different choices. They choose to move outside of the city rather than live in the city. They choose to live in smaller apartments or to get a roommate rather than living on their own. Prices reflect the demand for housing. Only in places where the government tries to help the poor do we start to see the poor larger homelessness, more rundown communities, and more abandoned buildings from people who can't afford to take care of them anymore.